It's raining! Yay! I've been waiting for this for ages. Ages! That's right. It's good for the flowers and the plants and the trees and the bushes and stuff like that. So, what's weird about today? That's right, I'm wearing a bow tie and I look ridiculous, but I love it. Oh, and it's a Saturday, which I don't normally read on Saturdays, but that's because of Blackout Tuesday. I didn't read on Tuesday, and so I'm going to read today to finish my book, Prince Caspian, Part 10. So let's finish it. Let's go to the end, see what happens, and then who knows what we'll read next week. I don't even know. I don't know. Anyway, right. So yesterday, chapter 9, I think we're in. No, we're not. We're not in chapter 9, are we? We're in chapter 14. They just had an epic fight, and Peter won. Although, well, I mean, he knocked Miraz onto the floor, and then Miraz's own men came and stabbed him good, which wasn't very nice. So Peter won, and then the Telmarine army were crossed, and they started charging, and so the Narnians are charging back, and the last thing that was said was, full battle was joined. So let's see where it goes, shall we, and come to the end of the story. Without further ado, this chapter is called How All Were Very Busy. "Come back, Ribbercheap, you little ass!" shouted Peter. "You'll only be killed. This is no place for mice." But the ridiculous little creatures were dancing in and out among the feet of both armies, jabbing with their swords. Many a Telmarine warrior that day felt his foot suddenly pierced, as if by a dozen skewers, hopped on one leg, cursing in pain, and fell as often as not. If he fell, the mice finished him off. If he did not, someone else did. Oh! But almost before the old Narnians were really warmed to their work, they found the enemy giving way. Tough-looking warriors turned white, gazing in terror, not on the old Narnians, but on something behind them, and then flung down their weapons, shrieking, "The word! The word! The end of the world!" But soon neither their cries nor the sound of weapons could be heard any more, for both were drowned in the ocean-like roar of the awakened trees as they plunged through the ranks of Peter's army and then on in pursuit of the Telmarines. Have you ever stood at the edge of a great wood on a high ridge when a wild southwester, a blowy wind, broke over it in full fury on an autumn evening? Imagine that sound, and then imagine that wood, instead of being fixed to one place, was rushing at you, and was no longer trees, but huge people, yet still like trees because their long arms waved like branches, and their heads tossed and their leaves fell around them in showers. It was like that for the Telmarines. It was a little alarming even for the Narnians. In a few minutes, all of Miraz's followers were running down to the great river, in the hope of crossing the bridge to the town of Baruna, and there defending themselves behind ramparts and closed gates. They reached the river, but there was no bridge. It had disappeared since yesterday. Then utter panic and horror fell upon them, and they all surrendered. But what had happened to the bridge? Early that morning, after a few hours' sleep, the girls had woken to see Aslan standing over them and to hear his voice saying, "We will make holiday." They rubbed their eyes and looked around them. The trees had all gone, but could still be seen moving away toward Aslan's howl in a dark mass. Bacchus and the Maenads, his fierce madcap girls, and Silenus were still with them. Lucy, fully rested, jumped up. Everyone was awake. Everyone was laughing. Flutes were playing. Cymbals and clashing. Animals, not talking animals, were crowding in upon them from every direction. "What is it, Aslan?" said Lucy, her eyes dancing and her feet wanting to dance. "Come, children," said he. "Ride on my back again today." "Oh, lovely!" cried Lucy, and both girls climbed onto the warm, golden back as they'd done no one knew how many years before. Then the whole party moved off. Aslan leading, Bacchus and his Maenads leaping, rushing and turning somersaults, the beasts frisking round them, and Silenus and his donkey bringing up the rear. And here's a picture of them. If you remember from a few days ago, Bacchus and Silenus are these people who were dancing around. And they were going, yuan, yuan, oi, oi, oi. Just singing, basically. Right, so all the big crowd. They turned a little to the right, then raced down a steep hill, and found a long bridge of Baruna in front of them. Before they began to cross it, however, up out of the water came a great, wet, bearded head, larger than a man's, crowned with rushes. It looked at Aslan, and out of its mouth a deep voice came. "Hail, Lord," it said. "Loose my chains." Who on earth is that? Whispered Susan. I think it's the river god. But hush, said Lucy. Bacchus, said Aslan. Deliver him from his chains. That means the bridge, I expect, thought Lucy. And so it did. Bacchus and his people slashed forward into the shallow water, and a minute later the most curious thing began happening. Great strong trunks of ivy came curling up all over the piers of the bridge, growing as quickly as a fire grows, wrapping the stones round, splitting, breaking, separating them. The walls of the bridge turned into hedges, gay with hawthorn for a moment, and then disappeared, as the whole thing with a rush and a rumble collapsed into the swirling water. Here's a picture of the river god. Loose my chains. All gone. With much splashing, screaming, and laughter, the revellers waded or swam or danced across the ford. Hurrah! It's the ford of Baruna again now! Hoo-hoo! And up the bank on the far side and into the town they went. Everyone in the streets fled before their faces. The first house they came to was a school, a girls' school, where a lot of Narnian girls, with their hair done very tight and ugly tight collars round their necks, and thick tickly stockings on their legs, were having a history lesson. The sort of history that was taught in Narnia under Maraz's rule. It was duller than the truest history you ever heard, and less true than the most exciting adventure story.
If you don't attend, Gwendolen,
said the mistress,
and stop looking out of the window, I shall have to give you an order mark.
But please, Miss Prizzle, began Gwendolen.
Do you hear what I said, Gwendolen?
Asked Miss Prizzle. But please, Miss Prizzle, said Gwendolen, there's a lion.
Take 2 order marks for talking nonsense,
said Miss Prizzle.
And now...
A roar interrupted her. Ivy came curling in at the windows of the classroom. The walls became a mass of shimmering green, and leafy branches arched overhead where the ceiling had been. Miss Prizzle found she was standing on a grass in a forest glade. She clutched at her desk to steady herself, and found that her desk was a rose bush. Wild people, such as she had never ever imagined, were crowding round her. Then she saw the lion, screamed and fled, and with her fled her class, who were mostly dumpy, prim little girls with fat legs. Gwendolen hesitated. You'll stay with us, sweetheart? Said Aslan.
Oh, may I?
Thank you, said Gwendolen. Instantly she joined hands with 2 of the Maenads, who whirled her round in a merry dance and helped her take off some of the unnecessary and uncomfortable clothes that she was wearing. Wherever they went in the little town of Baruna, it was the same. Most of the people fled. A few joined them. When they left the town, they were a larger and a merrier company. They swept down across the level fields on the north bank, or left bank, of the river. At every farm, animals came out to join them. Sad old donkeys, who had never known joy, grew suddenly young again. Chained dogs broke their chains. Horses kicked their carts to pieces and came trotting along with them, clop, clop, kicking up the mud and whinnying. At a well in a yard, they met a man who was beating a boy. The stick burst into flour in the man's hand. He tried to drop it, but it stuck to his hand. His arm became a branch, his body the trunk of a tree. His feet took root. The boy, who had been crying a moment before, burst out laughing and joined them. There we go. Here's a picture of it. At a little town halfway to Beaver's Dam, where 2 rivers met, they came to another school, where a tired-looking girl was teaching arithmetic to a number of boys who looked very like pigs. She looked out of the window and saw the divine revellers singing up the street, and a stab of joy went through her heart. Aslan stopped right under the window and looked up at her. Oh, don't, she said. I'd love to, but I mustn't. I must stick to my work, and the children would be frightened if they saw you. Frightened? said the most pig-like of the boys. Who's she talking to out the window? Let's tell the inspector she talks to people out the window when she ought to be teaching us. Let's go and see who it is, said another boy, and they all came crowding to the window. But as soon as their mean little faces looked out, Bacchus gave a great cry of, Yuan, Yuan! Oi, oi, oi! And the boys all began howling with fright and trampling one another down to get out of the door and jumping out of the window. As it was said afterwards, whether truly or not, and those particular little boys were never seen again. but that there were a lot of very fine little pigs in that part of the country, which had never been seen there before. "Now, dear heart," said Aslan to the mistress, and she jumped down and joined them. At Beaver's Dam, they recrossed the river and came east again along the southern bank. They came to a little cottage where a child stood in the doorway crying. "Why are you crying, my love?" asked Aslan. The child, who had never seen a picture of a lion, was not afraid of him. "Auntie's very ill," she said. "She's going to die." And Aslan went to go at the door of their cottage. But it was too small for him. So when he got his head through, he pushed with his shoulders. Lucy and Susan fell off when he did this, and he lifted the whole house up, and it fell backwards and apart. And there, still in her bed, though the window was now in the open air, lay a little old woman who looked as if she had dwarf blood in her. She was at death's door, but when she opened her eyes and saw the bright, hairy head of the lion staring into her face, she didn't scream or faint. She said, "Oh, Aslan, I knew it was true. I've been waiting for this all my life. Have you come to take me away?" "Yes, dearest," said Aslan, "but not the long journey yet." And as he spoke, like the flush creeping along the underside of a cloud at sunrise, the colour came back to her white face, and her eyes grew bright, and she sat up and said, "Why, I do declare I feel that better. I think I could take a little breakfast this morning." "Here you are, mother," said Bacchus, dipping a pitcher in the cottage well and handing it to her. For what was in it now was not water, but the richest wine, red as red currant jelly, smooth as oil, strong as beef, warming as tea, cool as dew. "Hey, you've done something to our well," said the old woman. "That makes a nice change, that does." And she jumped out of bed. "Ride on me," said Aslan, and added to Susan and Lucy, "You two queens will have to run now." "But we'd like that just as well," said Susan, and off they went again. And so at last, with leaping and dancing and singing, with music and laughter and roaring and barking and neighing, they all came to a place where Miraz's army stood stood flinging down their swords, holding up their hands, and Peter's army, still holding their weapons and breathing hard, stood round them with stern and glad faces. And the first thing that happened was that the old woman slipped off Aslan's back and ran across to Caspian, and they embraced one another. For she was his old nurse! I didn't see that coming. Chapter 15, the final one of the story. Aslan makes a door in the air. At the sight of Aslan, the cheeks of the Telmarine soldiers became the colour of cold gravy. Their knees knocked together, and many fell on their faces. They had not believed in lions, and this made their fear greater. Even the red dwarfs, who knew that he came as a friend, stood with open mouths and couldn't speak. Some of the black dwarfs, who'd been of Nickabrick's party, began to edge away. But all the talking beasts surged round the lion, with purrs and grunts and squeaks and whinnies of delight, fawning on him, with their tails rubbing against him, touching him reverently with their noses, and going to and fro under his body and between his legs. If you've ever seen a little cat loving a big dog whom it knows and trusts, you'll have a pretty good picture of their behaviour. Then Peter, leading Caspian, forced his way through the crowd of animals. "This is Caspian, sir," he said, and Caspian knelt and kissed the lion's paw. "Welcome, Prince," said Aslan. "Do you feel yourself sufficient to take up the kingship of Narnia?" I don't think I do, sir," said Caspian. "I'm only a kid." "Good," said Aslan. "If you had felt yourself sufficient, it would have been a proof that you were not. Therefore, under us and under the High King, you shall be King of Narnia, Lord of Cair Paravel, and Emperor of the Lone Islands. You and your heirs while your race lasts, and your coronation. But what have we here?" For at that moment a curious little procession was approaching. 11 mice, 6 of whom carried between them something on a litter made of branches. But the litter was no bigger than a large atlas. No one had ever seen mice more woebegone than these. They were plastered with mud, some with blood too, and their ears were down, and their whiskers drooped, and their tails dragged in the grass, and their leader piped on his slender pipe a melancholy tune. On the litter lay what seemed to be little better than a damp head of fur. And that was left of Reaper Cheap. All that was left of him.
Sorry, I can't read.
All that was left of Reaper Cheap. He was still breathing, but more dead than alive, gushed with innumerable wounds, one paw crushed, and where his tail had been, a bandaged stump. Now, Lucy, said Aslan. Lucy had her diamond bottle out in a moment. Though only a drop was needed of each of Reaperchin's wounds, on each of his wounds. The wounds were so many that there was a long and anxious silence before she'd finished, and the mouse sprang from his litter. His hand went out at once to his sword hilt. With the other he twirled his whiskers. He bowed.
Hail, Aslan,
came his shrill voice.
I have the honour.
But then he suddenly stopped. The fact that he still had no tail, whether that Lucy had forgotten it, or that her cordial, though it could heal wounds, could not make things grow again. Reapership became aware of this loss, and he made his bow. Perhaps it altered something in his balance. He looked over his right shoulder, failing to see his tail. He strained his neck further till he had to turn his shoulders, and his whole body followed. But by that time his hindquarters had turned too, and were out of sight. Then he strained his neck, looking over his shoulder again, with the same result. Only after had he turned completely round 3 times did he realize this dreadful truth.
I am confounded,
said Reapercheap to Aslan.
I am completely out of countenance. I must crave your indulgence for appearing this unseemly fashion.
It becomes you very well, small one, said Aslan.
All the same,
said Reapercheap.
If anything could be done, perhaps, Her Majesty.
And here he bowed to Lucy. And what do you want with a tail? Asked Aslan.
Sir,
said the mouse,
I can eat and sleep and die for my king without one, but a tail is the honour and glory of a mouse.
I have sometimes wondered, friend, said Aslan, whether you do not think too much about your honour.
Highest of all high kings, said Reapercheap, permit me to remind you that a very small size has been bestowed on us mice, and if we did not guard our dignity, some, who weigh worth by inches, would allow themselves very unsuitable pleasantries at our expense. This is why I've been at some pains to make it known that no one who does not wish to feel this sword as near his heart as I can reach shall talk in my presence about traps, or toasted cheese, or candles. No, sir, not the tallest fool in Narnia.
Here he glared very fiercely up at Wimbleweather. But the giant, who was always a stage behind everyone else, had not yet discovered what was being talked about down at his feet, and so missed the point. Why have your followers all drawn their swords, may I ask? Said Aslan.
May it please your highness, your high majesty,
said the second mouse, whose name was
Peepercheek.
Oh, sorry, Peeperseek. Oh, well.
We are all waiting to cut off our own tails. If our chief must go without his, we will not bear the shame of wearing an honour which is denied to the high mouse.
Ah, roared Aslan, you have conquered me. You have great hearts. Not for the sake of your dignity, Reapercheap, but for the love that is between you and your people, and still more for the kindness your people showed me long ago, when you ate away the cords that bound me on the stone table. And it was then, though you have long forgotten it, that you began to be talking mice. You shall have your tail again. Woo. Before Aslan had finished speaking, the new tail was in its place. Then, at Aslan's command, Peter bestowed the knighthood of the Order of the Lion on Caspian, and Caspian, as soon as he was knighted, himself bestowed it on Trufflehunter and Trumpkin and Reapercheap, and made Dr. Cornelius his Lord Chancellor, and confirmed the Bulgy Bear in his hereditary office of Marshal of the Lists. And there was great applause. That was the bear. After this, the Telmarine soldiers, firmly but without taunts or blows, were taken across the ford, and all put under lock and key in the town of Baruna, and given beef and beer. That's not bad for prisoners, huh? They made a great fuss about wading in the river, for they all hated and feared running water just as much as they hated and feared woods and animals. But in the end, the nuisance was over, and then the nicest part of that long day began. Lucy, sitting close to Aslan, and divinely comfortable, wondered what the trees were doing. At first, she thought they were merely dancing. They were suddenly going round slowly in 2 circles, one from left to right and the other from right to left. Then she noticed that they kept throwing something down in the centre of both circles. Sometimes she thought they were cutting off long strands of their hair, and at other times it looked as if they were breaking off bits of their fingers. But, if so, they had plenty of fingers to spare, and it didn't hurt them. But whatever they were throwing down, when it reached the ground it became brushwood or dry sticks. Then 3 or 4 of the red dwarfs came forward with their tinder boxes and set light to the pile, which first crackled, and then blazed, and finally roared, as a woodland bonfire on midsummer night ought to do, and everyone sat down in a wide circle round it. Then Bacchus and Silenus and the Maenads began a dance, far wilder than the dance of the trees, not merely a dance for fun and beauty, though it was that too, but a magic dance of plenty, and where their hands touched and where their feet fell, the feast came into existence. Sides of roasted meat that filled the grove with delicious smells, and wheaten cakes and oaten cakes for the gluten-free people, honey and many-coloured sugars, and cream as thick as porridge, and as smooth as still water, peaches, nectarines, pomegranates, pears, grapes, strawberries, raspberries, pyramids, and cataracts of fruit. Cataracts, interesting. Then, in great wooden cups and bowls, and mazers, wreathed with ivy, came the wines, dark thick ones like syrups, of mulberry juice, and clear red ones with red jellies liquefied, and yellow wines, and green wines, and yellow-green, and greenish-yellow.
Oh, it looks tasty.
Looks very fruity.
Come on, focus. Oh, never mind.
But for the tree people, different fare was provided. When Lucy saw Clodsley Shovel and his moles scuffling up the turf in various places, which Bacchus had pointed out to them, and realised that the trees were going to eat earth, it gave her rather a shudder. But when she saw that the earths were actually brought up to them, she felt quite different. They began with a rich brown loam that looked almost exactly like chocolate. So like chocolate, in fact, that Edmund tried a piece of it, but he didn't find it at all nice. When the rich loam had taken the edge of their hunger, the trees turned to the earth of the kind you see in Somerset, which is almost pink. They said it was lighter and sweeter. At the cheese stage, they had a chalky soil, and then went on to delicate confections of the finest gravels, powdered with choice silver sand. They drank very little wine, and it made the hollies very talkative. For the most part, they quenched their thirst with deep draughts of mingled dew and rain, flavoured with forest flowers and the airy taste of the thinnest clouds. I don't think I've ever read out in my life about people eating soil. But there's a time for everything. And for you guys who don't know, Somerset is in the southwest of England. Very close to where I grew up. Yar. Right. Then Aslan feasted the Narnians till long after the sunset had died away. Thus he did, and the stars had come out, and the great fire, now hotter but less noisy, shone like a beacon in the dark woods, and the frightened Telmarines saw it from far away and wondered what it might mean. The best thing of all about this feast was that there was no breaking up or going away, but as the talk grew quieter and slower, one after another would begin to nod and finally drop off to sleep, with feet towards the fire and good friends on either side, till at last there was silence all round the circle, and the chattering of water over stone at the ford of Baruna could be heard once more. But all night Aslan and the moon gazed upon each other with joyful and unblinking eyes. Keeping a track of the time. This doesn't tell me how long I've been going on for. Meh. Next day, messengers, who were chiefly squirrels or birds, were sent all over the country with a proclamation to the scattered Telmarines, including, of course, the prisoners in Baruna. They were told that Caspian was now king, and that Narnia would henceforth belong to the talking beasts, and the dwarves and the dryads and fauns, and other creatures quite as much as to men. Any who chose to stay under the new conditions might do so, but for those who didn't like the idea, Aslan would provide another home. Anyone who wished to go there must come to Aslan and the kings at the ford of Baruna by noon on the 5th day. You may imagine that this caused plenty of head-scratching among the Telmarines. Some of them, chiefly the young ones, had, like Caspian, heard stories of the old days, and were delighted that they had come back. They were already making friends with the creatures. These all decided to stay in Narnia. Excuse me. But most of the older men, especially those who'd been important under Marius, were sulky and had no wish to live in a country where they could not rule the roost. And here's a picture of the birds. Birds with letters. Live here with a lot of blooming performing animals? No fear, they said. And ghosts too, some added with a shudder. That's what those dryads really are. It's not canny. They were also suspicious. I don't trust him, they said. Not with that awful lion and all. He won't keep his claws off us long, you'll see. But then they were equally suspicious of his offer to give them a new home. Take us off to his den and eat us one by one, most likely, they muttered. And the more they talked to one another about the sulkier and more suspicious they became. But on the appointed day, more than half of them turned up. At one end of the glade, Aslan had caused to be set up 2 stakes of wood, higher than a man's head, about 3 feet apart. A third and lighter piece of wood was bound across them at the top, uniting them, so the whole thing looked more like a doorway to nowhere, inside into nowhere, from nowhere into nowhere. In front of this stood Aslan himself, with Peter on his right and Caspian on his left. Grouped round them were Susan, Edmund and Lucy, Trumpkin and Trufflehunter, the Lord Cornelius, Glenstorm, Reapercheap, and others. The children, I would do their accents one by one, but no. The children and the dwarves had made good use of the royal wardrobes in what had been the castle of Baraz, and was now the castle of Caspian. And what with the silk and cloth of gold, with snowy linen glancing through slashed sleeves, with silver mail shirts and jewelled sword hilts, with gilt helmets and feathered bonnets, they were almost too bright to look at. Even the beasts wore rich chains about their necks. Yet nobody's eyes were on them or the children. The living and strokable gold of Aslan's mane outshone them all. The rest of the old Narnians stood down each side of the glade. At the far end stood the Telmarines. The sun shone brightly, and pennants fluttered in the light wind. Men of Telmar, said Aslan, you who seek a new land, hear my words. I will send you all to your own country, which I know, and you do not know. We don't remember Telmar. We don't know where it is. We don't know what it's like, grumbled the Telmarines. You came into Narnia out of Telmar, said Aslan. But you came into Telmar from another place. You do not belong to this world at all. You came hither certain generations ago out of that same world to which the High King Peter belongs. At this, half the Telmarines began whimpering. There you are, told you so. He's going to kill us all, send us all right out of the world. And the other half began throwing out their chests and slapping one another on the back and whispering, there you are. Might have guessed we didn't belong to this place with all its queer, nasty, unnatural creatures. We're of royal blood, you see. And even Caspian and Cornelius and the children turned to Aslan with looks of amazement on their faces. Peace, said Aslan in a low voice, which was nearer to a growl. The earth seemed to shake a little, and every living thing in the grove became still as stone. You, Sir Caspian, said Aslan, might have known that you could be no true king of Narnia unless, like the kings of old, you were a son of Adam, and came from the world of Adam's sons. And so you are. Many years ago in that world, in the deep sea of that world, which is called the South Sea, a shipload of pirates were driven by a storm on an island. And there they did as pirates would, killed the natives and took the native women for wives, and made palm wine, and drank, and were drunk, and lay in the shade of the palm trees, and woke up and quarrelled, and sometimes killed one another. And in one of these frays, 6 were put to flight by the rest, and fled with their women into the centre of the island, and up a mountain, and went, as they thought, into a cave to hide. But it was one of the magical places of that world, one of the chinks or chasms between worlds in old times. But they have grown rarer. This was one of the last. I do not say the last. And so they fell, or rose, or blundered, or dropped right through, and found themselves in this world, in the land of Telmar, which was then unpeopled. But why it was unpeopled is a long story. I will not tell it now. And in Telmar their descendants lived and became a fierce and proud people. And after many generations there was a famine in Telmar, and they invaded Narnia, which was then in some disorder, but that would also be a long story. And they conquered it and ruled it. Do you mark all this well, King Caspian? I do indeed, sire, said Caspian. I was wishing that I came of a more honourable lineage. You come of the Lord Adam and the Lady Eve, said Aslan, and that is both honour enough to erect the head of the poorest beggar, and shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor on earth. Be content. Caspian bowed. And now, said Aslan, you men and women of Telmar, will you go back to that island in the world of men from which your fathers first came? It is no bad place. The race of those pirates who first found it has died out, and it is without inhabitants. There are good wells of fresh water and fruitful soil and timber for building, and fish in the lagoons, and the other men of the world have not yet discovered it. The chasm is open for your return, but this I must warn you, that once you've gone through, it will close behind you forever. There will be no more commerce between the worlds by that door. There was silence for a moment, then a burly, decent-looking fellow among the Telmarine soldiers pushed forward and said, Well, I'll take that offer. It is well chosen, said Aslan, and because you have spoken first, strong magic is upon you. Your future in that world should be good. Come forth. The man, now a little pale, came forward. Aslan and his court drew aside, leaving him free access to the empty doorway of the stakes. Go through it, my son, said Aslan, bending towards him and touching the man's nose with his own. As soon as the lion's breath came upon him, a new look came into the man's eyes, startled but not unhappy, as if he were trying to remember something. Then he squared his shoulders and walked through the door. Everyone's eyes were fixed on him. They saw the 3 pieces of wood, and through them the trees and grass and sky of Narnia. They saw the man between the doorposts. Then in 1 second, he had vanished utterly. And he's wearing a funny hat. Oh! 3 more paragraphs. From the other end of the glade, the remaining Telmarines set up a wailing. Ah! What's happened to him? Do you mean to murder us? We won't go that way! And then one of the clever Telmarines said, We don't see any other world through these sticks. If you want us to believe in it, why doesn't one of you go? All of your own friends are keeping well away from the sticks. Instantly, Reepicheep stood forward and bowed. If my example could be of any service, Aslan, he said, I will take 11 mice through that arch at your bidding, without a moment's delay. Nay, little one, said Aslan, laying his velvety paw ever so lightly on Reepicheep's head. They would do dreadful things to you in that world. They would show you at fairs. It is others who must lead. Come on, said Peter suddenly to Edmund and Lucy. Our time's up. What do you mean? Said Edmund. This way, said Susan, who seemed to know all about it. Back into the trees. We've got to change. Change what? Asked Lucy. Our clothes, of course, said Susan. Nice fools we look on the platform of an English station in these. But, our other things are at Caspian's castle, said Edmund. No, they're not, said Peter, still leading the way into the thickest wood. They're all here. They were brought down in bundles this morning. It's all arranged. Was that what Aslan was talking to you and Susan about this morning? Asked Lucy. Yes, that and other things, said Peter, his face very solemn. I can't tell it all to you. There were things he wanted to say to Sue and me, because we're not coming back to Narnia. Never? Cried Edmund and Lucy in dismay. Oh, you two are, answered Peter. At least, from what he said, I'm pretty sure he means you get to come back someday. But not Sue and me. He says we're getting too old. Oh, Peter, said Lucy. What awful bad luck! Can you bear it? Well, I think I can, said Peter. It's all rather different from what I thought. You'll understand when it comes to your last time. But quick, here are our things. It was odd and not very nice to take off their royal clothes and to come back into their school things, not very fresh now, into that great assembly. 1 or 2 of the nastier Telmarines jeered, but the other creatures all cheered and rose up in honour of Peter the High King and Queen Susan of the Horn, and King Edmund and Queen Lucy. There were affectionate and, on Lucy's part, tearful farewells with all their old friends, animal kisses and hugs from the Baldy Bears, and hands wrung by Trumpkin, and a last tickly, whiskerish embrace from Truffle Hunter. Goodbye. And of course Caspian offered the horn back to Susan, and of course Susan told him to keep it, And then, wonderfully and terribly, it was farewell to Aslan himself, and Peter took his place with Susan's hands on his shoulder, and Edmund on hers and Lucy's on his, and the first of the Telmarines on Lucy's, and so on, in a long line that moved forward to the door. After that came a moment which is hard to describe, but the children seemed to be there, to be seeing three things at once. One was the mouth of a cave opening into the glaring green and blue of an island in the Pacific, where all the Telmarines would find themselves the moment they were through the door. The second was a glade in Narnia, the faces of dwarves and beasts, the deep eyes of Aslan, the white patches on the badger's cheeks. But the third, which rapidly swallowed up the other two, was the grey, gravelly surface of a platform in a country station, and a seat with luggage round it, where they were all sitting as if they never moved from it. A little flat and dreary for a moment after all they'd been through, but also, unexpectedly, nice in its own way, what with the familiar railway smell and the English sky and the summer term before them. "Well," said Peter, "we have had a time." "Bother," said Edmund. "I left my new torch in Narnia." "Ha ha! Woohoo! And that's the end of Prince Caspian. Oh, it's very sad. It must be very sad to say goodbye to everybody, but hey, they got each other. Marvellous. I enjoyed that. It was different. It's kind of story you want to listen to before bed, actually. It's just kind of lots of walking around. Like the Lord of the Rings. Lots of walking, talking, and thinking. Compared to things like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which are all action and whoa! So yeah. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope that you share it around so others may enjoy it as well. And I will see you at some point in the future for another story. Goodbye, and thank you.